Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey-Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Hello, I'm Jo Hickey-Hall. I'm the creator and host of the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. I'm delighted to bring you the next episode, which my friends Bethan Briggs-Miller, host of Eerie Essex and Spectre of the Sea, and Icy Sedgwick from Fabulous Folklore, agreed to help me out with this summer. So thanks very much to them, and also to Kate Ray and Claire Casely, who created the last episode. I'm back in the early September with an interview with Patrick Harper, author of Demonic Reality. I know many of you who are interested in this kind of research will be very keen on hearing what he has to say. So look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, if you fancy joining us on Patreon, do hop by. There's always something going on and it's a really warm community. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe and please share. See you soon. Time to renovate. Time to renovate.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast.
Except you're not Jo, are you?
I'm not. No, I'm not. And I don't think I could pretend to be. Yeah, no, sorry, everyone. It's not Jo this week. I tried to do her lovely dulcet tones, but you have to stick with mine and Icy's. So yeah, let's introduce ourselves.
Oh, bringing the chaos already.
We're stepping in this week for Jo, who is out and about doing summer holiday stuff. So I like to think of us as substitute teachers.
Nice.
Yeah, as you say, we're bringing the chaos. So my name is Bethan Briggs-Miller. You might have heard me on Eerie Essex or Spectre of the Sea, and co-hosting with Icy Sedgwick. Take it away, Icy.
I'm Icy from Fabulous Folklore, and I pop up on various other podcasts, like the Folklore podcast I've been on and so on, and what have you. Basically, you can't get away from me a lot of the time.
And why would we want to?
Well, there's some people would, but we'll not talk about them.
No. So we've gone through different databases and reports and set the fairy census and tried to find lots of different stories, encounters of fairies. I've stuck to Wales because I hardly ever get to do my hometown or my home country because I'm normally in Essex doing Essex stuff. So I've taken the opportunity to delve into some Welsh folklore. I see. Where are you concentrating?
It's mostly Northumberland, a bit of Tyneside, and I want to say, is one of them County Durham? Yeah, two of them are County Durham. So it's basically kind of northeast, because I don't normally do County Durham, which is daft because it's just down the road. But I think if you take the kingdom of Northumbria as a whole, we do have quite a lot of similarities across folklore anyway. So it kind of makes sense to sort of look at it as slightly more of a group of stories rather than. I said a group of Tories there. That would be awful. I'm so sorry.
That's really scary.
That's the first swear word of the day.
Have a trigger warning there.
Brief mention of Tories. But yeah, so I've sort of tried to stick to what I know basically, and a lot of these are stories that I've heard since I was little, because they're the ones that just kind of kick about quite a lot, so they're already in like the northeast consciousness to a degree.
I like hearing, like, especially stories where people have grown up, because it tells you a lot more about the area and like the feel of it.
Yeah, very much so.
Right, well, then it's just a case of who wants to go first.
I mean, we're going to flip for it even, or shall I just let you go?
We could flip. Well, would you like to hear about a fat ox?
Oh, yes.
Okay. I shall tell you about the fat ox. Let me get my story up. Okay, so this takes place in the Gower. I found loads of stories about the Gower, which is in the south, sort of like mid Wales along the coast. So just past Swansea. It's beautiful landscape. I don't know if you know the Gower at all, but it's like, if we could guarantee the weather, you really wouldn't need to go abroad, because they're like, white sandy beaches, but it's Wales, so we don't get the weather. Hey ho. And this is actually from a place called Einan's Ford, which I think has a really nice sound to it already. And it needs a fairy tale.
It sounds a bit Tolkien-esque.
Does, doesn't it? Einan's Ford. And this is about a farmer who was woken one night by the strange sound of soft, sweet music, which you hear a lot in these tales. And the farm he lived in was a long house, so he actually slept in the house with the animals. So from his bed, he could see straight into the cattle and where they were being kept at night. And the sound seemed to be coming from there. And he also heard the patter of tiny feet as if they were dancing, and they was going round and round, and he heard, as I say, this music. So he crept out of bed and looked into the barn, and it was filled with the Very folk. Now, in Swansea area, and that's sort of West Glamorgan and the Gower, they refer to the fairy as the Very folk, because it's believed bad luck to call them fae, to call them fairy, or use any of their names like the Eithliach. I really struggle to say this because I've got a lisp. The Welsh language is not kind to people with a lisp. The Eithliach. Nah, I'm going to give that up. Or the Coblinai, or you weren't supposed to, in this area, refer to their name. And as I said, the shed was filled with these folk, and they were dancing around, and they seemed to be gathering around, in particular, a large ox who was quite happily chewing the cud. It didn't seem to be fazed at all by these little creatures that were dancing around, and they were having a whale of a time. They were jumping and spinning. So they were playing a game where they were spinning around and then jumping onto one of the points of the cow's horn, and then jumping off again. And the farmer was really enjoying this. This is cool. I'm going to just sit back and just watch this now. And he was enjoying the music. And one of them was playing the fiddle. And it was proper like, one of those Arthur Rackham paintings where they're all dancing around. So that's a lovely story, isn't it? That's what I thought. And then the music died down. And then it suddenly turned into something out of a horror film. So suddenly they killed the ox and started to skin it.
Oh, the poor ox.
I know, right? And then they hung it from the beams. And then they all started swarming into the barn and began eating it. And then it gets grimmer. Or not so grimmer. Depends on how you feel about it. But once they'd eaten it all and eaten all the meats and, they'd had their merry time, they gathered all the bones together and started putting it back together again. Like some weird jigsaw. Except they couldn't find one piece of a bone. And apparently they absolutely lost their... I don't know if you can swear on Joe's podcast. They lost their shit. We can buzz that out. And they were pulling their hair out and they were running around absolutely like wailing and arguing with each other about where this bone was. And anyway, they gave up looking for this bone. Once they put the skeleton together, they threw the skin back over again, and the ox was standing there as if nothing had happened. And they left. And then the next day, when he let the cattle out in the morning, that particular ox was limping in the leg where the little bone was missing.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's really interesting, because it just makes us think of there's one of the Greek myths where, I've forgotten his name, but one of the human kings ends up serving his own son to the gods.
Yes.
And when I think it's Demeter, because she's obviously distracted by the fact that her daughter's been kidnapped, she eats part of it. And then when they put the kid back together, he's got like a knackered shoulder or something.
Yeah, that thing, when I looked up that book, the Book of Lost Gods, I briefly read that bit, and yeah, it was, I can't remember the name now, but it was a bit of the shoulder, like a shoulder bone or a collar, one of the collarbone or the blade or something. There was something wrong with the shoulder. But yeah, this was back end of Wales in the middle of nowhere.
I mean, on one hand, like that is super grim. And I suppose you could argue, what was the farmer going to do with the ox? He probably wasn't going to have a jolly time anyway. But I just think the idea of like, yeah, we're going to eat our fill and then give you it back is really odd, but kind of like so it starts out off like really lovely, and then it gets a bit like, oh my god, what's going on? And then it's kind of, oh, okay then.
Yeah, you're left a bit.
You did
Thanks.
go on quite a journey with that one.
I know. I was reading it. This is lovely because we often hear, like music and people being like lured into the other realm, or at the very most, like disappearing for a few years, then coming back, or not coming back, but not eaten.
Or maybe they are, and that we just don't hear that part.
Oh, maybe they're eaten and then they put the skin back on and then send them back outside again.
Ew.
Ew. Yeah. So there you go. I don't know if you've had your lunch yet, but
Oh god, I'm really, really glad I had a vegan burger now.
yeah.
I think this is the thing, like, because fairy music never ends well
No.
in these, and I kind of feel like it sort of doesn't necessarily end well for the ox, but then it kind of does.
Yeah. I don't know if it was. I mean, my little sort of like brain, like the cogs are going. Could it have been sleep paralysis? Did he, I don't know, like imagine it all or dream it all? Or that is quite a dream. And then he was limping the next day. And then I started thinking, some folk tales come about because they're trying to warn people, like, don't go to this particular place. So don't follow the music, otherwise you could end up as an all-you-can-eat buffet.
It's a funny one because you also sort of think, like, if you were going to dream something, most people don't have a good enough imagination that they would dream something that they'd like never seen before. You know how they sometimes say that like, everybody you see in your dream you've seen somewhere in reality at some point. So you then think, so he's obviously seen enough of each of the different bits.
Yeah.
For his brain to then put, but then I'm always a little bit like disappointed when people go, it was all a dream. And that's and something, it's probably more likely that it was a dream than it being real. But
there's always that but, isn't there?
Yeah.
Because I think the farm is still there and they've got cattle. They've got black the horned cattle, like they still got those there. So part of me is wondering, is the ox like descended? Is its like great descendant still at that farm? And the farm is near a place called Fairy Hill. Yeah. That was my dun 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 moment.
I suppose it's, yeah, I think that is a funny one though, because of the fact that the cautionary tale one, it's like, usually it's to get you not to do something, but that guy was like on his own property.
Because he did want, I mean, part of the story said he wanted to get up and stop, but he felt he shouldn't. So I'd like to know what would have happened if he'd have gone, hey up, do you mind not eating my cow?
They probably wouldn't have put back together again.
Yeah. Or if he stopped them before. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of them. I mean, it was described as a swarm.
Oh, that's not a word that you ever apply to anything good, is it?
No, there's not. No, you never get a swarm of anything positive, do you?
Like a swarm of lollipops. Don't know why my brain went to lollipops. But there we go.
A swarm of dairy milk chocolate.
Yeah, I don't. It's an interesting story though, and you kind of wonder, like, because normally you see motifs, and we obviously said, well, there's like that one, and I wonder, is it Tantalus?
Yes, I think it is Tantalus.
Yeah, because I know both him and Sisyphus both have like the really horrible punishments, and like Sisyphus has somehow weirdly become like this bizarre like poster boy for like hustle culture, and it's like, no, Sisyphus was a horrible individual. That was why he was supposed to be going to the underworld in the first place. Like, you tricked the gods like 3 times. He's not like life goals. But yes, it might have been Tantalus because he's the other wrong'un. I remember. But yeah, so it's just really weird that the motif appears in sort of like ancient mythology. So it'd be interesting to know if that same story kind of has variations in other parts of the British Isles, or if it's very specific to the location.
I did try and find out because I found this story a bit late in the day, but I did a quick look to see if I could find any fair folk eating and then reassembling, and I found lots of the idea of a fairy feast appears quite often in like folklore, but I've yet to see the DIY, deconstructed meal put back together again.
I suppose when you think about it, like how would you know how often this was actually happening? Like this could be happening like everywhere, but because nobody had walked across it, it's like nobody would know that it was happening. So you could have like literally one of your animals every night. This would happen, but if everything got put back together normally, you'd just be like none the wiser.
It made me think of you do see some crossover with like alien lore and fairy lore, and the idea of cattle mutilations.
I've heard it's like sheep mutilations and stuff, but that tends to be more like alien big cat stuff.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, there's still a lot of cattle mutilations happening in America. I'm watching skin. That's my stomach. I must have got hungry from listening to this time, which is quite worrying. There's a lot of cattle mutilations, and they're very specific as well. An eye is always taken, one eye, the reproductive organs, and an ear, which is weird because if it was like anything like an animal or like a coyote or a bear, it would be different. There wouldn't be like a strategic, oh, I'm just going to take this and this and this, and leave it. And there's never any blood. And it's weird, like if cattle mutilations had happened back in day, maybe in this country, and there are some in this country, would we have put it down to the Fae?
Probably. Same as I suppose if you had a bit of an odd dream and then noticed the next day that one of your animals was limping, is there a possibility that you would have gone, so my dream was true then, and you've kind of connected two completely unrelated things as cause and effect when actually they were just two completely unrelated things.
It's a good one to get your teeth into.
But
I think we've got as much as this one as we can. It's getting grimmer by the minute. Do you want to share one of yours, Han?
I think I'm gonna start off with one of my favourites. And if anyone's obviously ever come across stuff that I've done before, they'll probably have heard of her. But I know that she's not really known, like outside of Northumberland and Tyneside, really. And I think that's a bit of a shame. But she's interesting because of the fact that where you said there's a lot of crossover with fairies and aliens, you also, and in my view, get quite a lot of crossover with fairies and ghosts. It's like, I say a ghost, I mean, is a poltergeist really a ghost? I'm not sure, but it's like you do get that sort of, particularly where brownies are concerned. And that's where this one called Silky kind of straddles that divide, where some of her behaviour is that of a brownie, some of it is closer to that of a boggart, and then periodically she'll do things which feel more like a ghost would do it. So I quite like the fact that she's just like, I'm going to ignore your stupid binary humans, and then kind of does her own thing, which is quite cool. But she, the first stories of her, because I'm going old school, I've got mine on paper. She's listed by William Henderson, who he's one of ours two folklorists that I tend to draw on quite a lot. Him and M.A. Richardson, and they basically Henderson went round and just collected a lot of folklore of sort of Northumberland and the borders and down into County Durham in the 1870s, and then the Folklore Society actually published his book for him.
Was he a reverend?
Possibly.
It seems like a lot of the fake folklorists that I come across, they seem to be reverends and people from the church seem quite attracted to studying fairies.
I think Henderson, he collects and he's also local as well, which is nice. He sort of collects a whole range of things, and he doesn't specifically have a fairy section in the book. There's one called Local Sprites, which I thought is quite interesting. And it did make me think of Rainbow Bright as well, which is a whole other tangent. But Silky gets her name because she announces her presence with like the sound of what sounds like rustling silk, which you would notice in those days, because obviously that wouldn't be a material most people would come across, and particularly where people would come across her, because she was particularly famous in the area around Blackheddon, and that's about 13 miles northwest of Newcastle. If you look at it on Google Maps, even now, it's mostly just farmland in the area. And what she used to like to do is, if anyone was traveling, particularly by horseback at night, she would just materialize on the back of the horse behind them, ride some distance with them, and then just disappear again. And you sort of think, if that's entertaining, then crack on. Like, it's fairly tame as fairy pranks go. It kind of sounds more like it would just be inconvenient and a bit irritating more than anything else. But at no point does she ever actually do anything particularly malicious.
Right.
It's an interesting sort of, she can be, as I say, vexing rather than anything else, but she is quite interesting. One of the things that she does do, which brings her into like the brownie category, is if you cleaned your house on a Saturday night so that you could rest on a Sunday, she would then cause chaos. And obviously, if you just left your house an absolute tip, she would come in and tidy it up. And I'm like, isn't it obvious what you would do?
Yes.
I mean, but that's just me. So so obviously people would, I'm assuming, kind of not leave the house looking too spick and span. But I mean, how good is that as an excuse for not doing your housework? Though, oh, I don't want to, because if I do, Silky will undo it. And I'm like, I'm going to have to borrow that one.
I'm going to try that one, yeah.
But the other thing that she did that was irritating, though, and this is again where I think you can see that link to fairy folk, is she would obviously ride on the back of horses, because why wouldn't you? She also used to just make them stop dead and refuse to move. So there's incidents where people would be going out on an errand, and then they'd be out in the middle of nowhere, and then the horse would suddenly just stop, and nothing could cajole it to move. And you were basically stuck there either until dawn, at which point all of her power seemed to end, or if someone came along with some rowan wood. And if they touched the horse with rowan wood, or indeed if you had rowan wood on your person, then her tricks and japes didn't work. So, I mean, that kind of leads off into a little bit of the realm of witchcraft as well.
Gonna say, yeah, especially with like transport or something stopping, would often be blamed on witches, wouldn't it?
But I do just think it's quite funny that, like, and obviously it's quite an easy way around the thing as well. So, well, I'll just make sure I've got some rowan with us and then all will be well. But again, it's like what she's doing, it's irritating. The horse is unharmed, the person's unharmed, so she's not doing it, she's more just doing it like in that almost kind of when a kid pulls a prank because they think it'll be funny and it's just tiresome. It's kind of more like that. But I just think that she's quite interesting despite all that, because she then started appearing at Belsay, which is a village, I've actually written it down. It's 2 miles northeast of Blackheddon, and there's a beautiful English heritage property there, Belsay Hall and Castle. Really, really interesting place in and of itself. But there's actually there used to be like woods around the house and the castle, which are now like the quarry garden. And apparently people sometimes would see her just wandering around in the woods. And if you did see her at twilight, you would see her sort of, and it would look like she was cutting down trees or splitting stones, and you would hear this like howling tempest, but then the whole wood would just look really calm and tranquil. And I just thought that was a really interesting thing, where she's kind of pottering about doing whatever it is that she's doing, like completely unrelated to whatever the people around her are doing, but it's just that sense that she's in this sense, she brings like the sound of a storm, even if there isn't one. Which I just thought was quite an interesting and unusual element to it. But the bit that sort of caught my eye is it's described in the book as being a lake at the bottom of the crag that had a waterfall coming into it. And I actually tried to look this up again on Google Maps to see if I could figure out where it was. And there's like an outflow kind of thing, or an outfall rather, from a lake into a pond. And I got in touch with English Heritage and actually sort of said, like, I've got a really weird question for you, but and the history department got in touch, and they were so helpful, and they were obviously like, oh, actually, yeah, that's a really interesting one. They were really nice. And they thought that the crag was actually the crag wood that's sort of south of the hall.
Right.
Because there was an oak tree, I think it was, that was right next to this waterfall, which apparently was it grown in such a way that it almost looked like the limbs had formed like a chair. And
Oh, wow.
and the chair was referred to as Silky's seat. Now, I cannot find any artist depictions of it anywhere. Obviously, it's like pre-photography. And at one point, one of the owners of the hall actually had the tree preserved, because you wouldn't really want to necessarily anger one of the good neighbours.
Yeah.
But apparently it seemed to be that they thought that she hadn't really been seen there after about 1846. So no one really knows kind of where she went. But she
What
did end
happened
up.
to the tree?
Well, I can't find any mention of the tree either, so I do think it must have been removed at some stage, but
Okay.
well after that. But apparently there was a break-in at the hall in the 1920s, and she even got the blame for that. So there seems to have been like a waning interest in her, kind of as her appearances kind of taper off. But there could be a reason for her appearances tapering off, and it's because she does then seem to appear in another location. Although, as I say, there was this idea that she just disappeared abruptly in 1846, which kind of implies that the sightings must have been quite regular for people to notice that she'd disappeared. And I feel like a lot of this was probably passed on orally. So by the time Richardson comes along, like 30 years later, there's not that many written records. It's just like people's recollections to work from. Some people thought that she'd actually been a ghost. And then there was in that particular theory, they thought that she'd hidden some treasure and died, and then couldn't rest until someone found it. And that one, there was a house nearby in Blackheddon where a ceiling just suddenly gave way, and they actually found gold wrapped in a calf skin hidden in the ceiling.
Oh, wow.
And it was around that time that our appearances seemed to stop. So people thought, oh well, our treasure's being found, so she can rest now. However, somebody else had a vicar had gone to see an old woman on her deathbed, and she claimed that she'd seen Silky at the bottom of her bed like the night before, and she'd announced her presence sort of with the rustling of silk. So, you know, it's difficult to know where Silky went or what happened next. However, the bit that caught my eye is the fact that there's a Silky at Denton Hall, which is like, now it's right next to one of the massive roundabouts, next to like this huge like 6-lane motorway. And it used to be who was it the diocese for? It used to be the diocese property for the Roman Catholic Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle, and they sold it in 2020. And I obviously haven't got any idea if they had any disturbances or anything in the house. But it's a Jacobean mansion built in 1622, and it looks completely out of place. But various people sort of lived there over time. And again, some people thought that Silky was a ghost because apparently it was a girl who was supposed to have been strangled by her sister. And she wore a white silk dress while she moved around the hall. However, that particular Silky was also believed to care for people while they were ill, which sort of, to me, kind of takes it out of the ghost territory a little bit. Other people said that this particular Silky used to basically scare people into leaving, but they don't say how, which is deeply infuriating for anyone looking into it now. It's like, oh, better records, people. But and then in like 1884, people said that they could hear the sound of things being dragged through empty rooms and down a flight of stairs. And people in the surrounding area claimed to hear her, and she also apparently was supposed to warn of any danger in the nearby mine. So local miners actually saw it as being quite a good luck charm. And that then made me think of like all the folklore that you've got around things like the knockers or the blue caps. And there's a Welsh one whose name I always can't pronounce.
Oblinai.
That one. Where they're basically they're helpful spirits, but you don't really see them as being ghosts. So again, you kind of start leaning back into that fairy territory with her again. But then the one that I found really interesting with it was that Catherine Briggs actually mentioned Silky in her encyclopedia, and apparently a woman called Mrs. Warner had actually lived two old women had lived, in Denton Hall, and Mrs. Warner's mother used to go and visit them and take this woman with her when she was a girl, and this would have been between about 1887 and 1902. And the two old ladies would talk about the Silky that lived at the hall, but they wouldn't let anyone laugh at her. And she would do things around the house for them. She would lay the fires. She would leave bunches of flowers on the stairs for them and things like that. And our antics used to annoy the staff more than anything else. And again, that's what made me then think, oh, is she undoing people's chores? When really they could have got her to help. It's
Yeah.
a light way of putting it. But apparently she wore grey silk, that particular one. So these two old ladies seemed very definite on the idea of there being a Silky living in the hall. And then the Warner family left Newcastle, so they didn't visit again after 1902. But then after the Second World War, the woman found an old friend of hers now owned Denton Hall, so she went to visit him. And the owner had seen or heard nothing around the house, but apparently there was what appeared to be a poltergeist haunting in his son's bedroom, and nobody would talk about it. And I think what caught my eye about that is the fact that obviously by 1940, whatever, just after or during the war, obviously there would have been such talk about ghosts and poltergeists and all this kind of activity, so you kind of think, have people just updated the language? So what in the 19th century or earlier, obviously, because you've got spiritualism comes along mid 19th century, but were people now reclassifying what was actually fairy activity as something else? So I thought that would have been interesting to find out. And I mean, there's the same thing as a house called Churton near North Shields, and the Duke of Argyll lived there during William III's reign. He had a mistress who died suddenly, and people were then trying to work out if the Silky at Churton was this mistress who died mysteriously, or if she was actually a proper Silky, because apparently she made unearthly noises, and apparently the owners couldn't find tenants because of the amount of noise she used to make around the property. So again, you sort of think, well, considering you've got these unearthly noises at Churton, you've got the unearthly noises at Denton Hall, is it the same Silky? Is it different? Is this actually quite a common spirit? But that's just the name that we've given it up here. And it does then make me sort of think, is it the fact that we notice the sound because silk's not that common even now? I mean, I'm not quite sure what a sort of polyester rayon mix would sound like if you were going to announce your presence with that. But it did make me think, and this is one of the reasons why I find it really interesting. Is she, or has she been lost to stories of poltergeists when actually we should have been looking at it as more of a brownie type creature, albeit a brownie who's actually quite a mischievous one. And she seems to have a very definite personality around her in a way that I think some of the generic stories don't have. So I find her really interesting on so many levels. And the number of times I'm like, I wish I could get in Denton Hall.
Is it still there?
Yeah, it's still there. As I say, they sold it in 2020, but I don't know who they sold it to. But with it being a Jacobean manor house, I would imagine it's probably listed. But
I reckon you should write a letter and go, please.
Can I come and see if you've got a Silky, please?
I think she sounds fab. As you say, I mean, it's not typical poltergeist because she's got different sides of her personality. Will be helpful but mischievous, depending on a whim. And then, I mean, there's a lot, especially again, comparing the two in Welsh folklore. There's a lot of stories of creatures that will jump on the back of people as they're riding, and they're normally put down to the devil. So you can see how the exact same phenomena can be called something else, just across the border. But what color? I mean, I know there was one that was grey, but the first story.
The first colour? Ones, I want to say that she was supposed to wear black, but that might be just preference for my favourite colour. I think they just sort of talk about the rustling silks at first, although the old woman who said that she'd sat at the bottom of her bed, she mentioned black silk. So you basically see it in black, white, or grey, which is interesting in and of itself, that it just seems to change colour. Because obviously, I know you get like white ladies and grey ladies in ghosts, and obviously, you know, ever since sort of like literature popularising, we then get sort of the woman in black figure as well.
Yeah.
But I think that it's like the audible side of our appearances is what always makes me really quite interested of, well, what exactly is going on here, for her to announce her presence through sound like that. And obviously we also have there's a grey lady at the assembly rooms in town who apparently you hear the swish of a taffeta gown when she's about. So it's not unheard of in ghost sightings. But that being said, I think because there almost seems to be a level of kind of consciousness and planning and almost like intelligent thought behind what Silky does. That's what then leads me down the route of something away from a poltergeist, which always seems to me to be a little bit like random and haphazard. Whereas like to actively tidy your house, that's
not poltergeist. That's especially the part where if you tidy, you're like, you know, it enrages them, but if you leave it for them, then you're rewarded, which is that's typical fairy lore, isn't it? And brownie and like and turning from a brownie into a boggart if you annoy them.
Yeah, and that's where you sort of think the one in Black Heddon, did she then go out to jump on people's backs and annoy the horses? Maybe was that how she got her kicks after she tidied the houses? I don't know. This is the trouble. There's so much not involved in the original reports that Henderson gives, and also M.A. Richardson gives quite a few of them as well in his local historian's table book, I think it is. But it's, I don't know, I just kind of think that because she sort of seems to defy classification, to me, it then makes you then start questioning, well, are all these different classifications even necessary? Or are we actually just talking about the same thing?
Oh, I really enjoyed that. I've heard the Silky story before, and I love hearing it every time because, as you say, it's got so many different parts to it, and I like it when there's a ghost or a fae or something or a creature with a personality that I can get behind.
Yeah, this is the thing. She feels like an actual entity, where, like, particularly when the two old ladies are like really protective of her as well. And I just
that is very sweet. That's a TV program I'd like to watch.
Yeah, I would. Oh my god, it would be like How Clean Is Your House, but the Silky edition. Then you could mix it with totally a box with the two old ladies. It'd be amazing.
Oh, it'd be brilliant. Yeah, we've got that idea. No one nicked that. That's our verbal.
Yeah, it's trademark now.
Trademark now.
I feel like we've pinched that from lawmen a little bit.
Yeah, they say they don't listen to podcasts, so they're not going to hear. No one tell them, okay? No one tell them.
You've got I'm trying to find then.
I do. I raided. I had a look in the fairy census, which was collected between 2014 and 17 by Simon Young for the Fairy Investigation Society. And it's fascinating, especially when you see encounters that happen in places it makes them feel a little bit more real. Like I was looking at some, because I was looking for you as well, like Durham. It's like, oh, that sounds mystical because it's in Durham and I don't know Durham that well. But suddenly it was around the corner from where I lived, and it's like, oh, has them, when you see on television, like you're watching Doctor Who and you see it's filmed at the end of your street. It's like, oh my goodness, that same feeling. I've got one here. I really like this one because I really like the description of what she saw, and again, and this is in the fairy census, but the way it's described, I think you know where I'm going with this. It could fit into a different category quite easily. So I'll read the testimony as it was written. So the way, I don't know if anybody in any of Joe's listeners have read the fairy census, but it's set out really nicely with like the first paragraph is very specific things that they're looking for, and is added at the beginning, and then it goes into the story. So this is in Wales, in the Rhondda Valley. This was a female. It was in the 2000s that it was seen. It was in a garden. The person was on their own. It was between 12 and 3 p.m. And it lasted for 2 to 10 minutes. They have had other regular supernatural experiences. No special state was reported. A profound silence before the experience, and a sense that the experience was a display put on especially for them. And I'm really glad they asked those, because I think if I was telling a story, I wouldn't even think about those things. If it's good, they get more information out of people with those like set questions when you fill in these reports. So the story starts. Early one afternoon in May, I was sitting out in my garden. The rhododendrons were in flower, and it was a bright, hot, sunny day. I was very comfortable and content to listen to the birds and just relax. Unexpectedly, I became aware of the golden outline of a figure down at the bottom of my garden. I say outline because it was not solid, but looked as though just its outline had been drawn with golden ink. The figure shimmered and had tall wings, but mostly it was transparent, like a rough sketch. It was about 3 foot tall and rose up in the air a little way before descending, and it did this several times. Then I saw a second winged figure, very much smaller. This was also golden, but I remember seeing a flash of blue and green. My first thought was it was a dragonfly, but on closer observation, I saw that it flew quite differently, and its shape was not that of an insect, but a small human-like figure. Next, I became aware of someone on the seat next to me, and although I could not see them, they were trying to get my attention. I could even see something pressing on my left upper arm, moving my clothing. And I had the strong impression that day that I was meant to see the fairies, and they were pleased about it. And it was a lovely experience, totally benign. I was amazed to see how the fairies really did look the way they appear in traditional tales. I've seen fairies many, many times since that day, and May, June is a particularly good time for them seeing them in my garden. I have photos of strange mists in that area of the garden from other years too. They varied. I've seen tiny ones, various colours, although the first was iridescent and reminded me of a dragonfly. And I've also seen one large one with a golden outline only, not unlike Atkinson Grimshaw's fairy paintings, although I hadn't seen those before my own experience and only made the connection later. I didn't hear any sounds. It was eerily quiet. And then they say that Wales is on the Celtic fringe. The whole country has a reputation for fairies. I just felt and still feel that it was fairies. We've had a house brownie here ever since we moved in 2000, and that is quite different to a fairy. Spirits attached to the land and operating in another world very close to ours that sometimes touches and allows us to interact. I think the gentle people should always be treated with respect. I hate the idea that they should be banished. There is plenty of space for us to coexist peacefully, and I think they have a great deal to teach us if we let them. I really like that encounter, the way it's described.
There's something really sort of like happy ending about it, because obviously so many encounters don't necessarily end well for the person involved, but that's like such a lovely one and such a positive one that I think you kind of think, oh, I'm really glad that person actually had that experience.
Yeah, it's lovely. I actually would love to experience that myself. That seems like especially the bit that really like called out to me was that profound sense of silence, which you see in so many cases, not just fae, but like UFO, ghost, there's always this before an event, before there's a crossing of the veil, there's a silence. And then this golden outline, that sounded absolutely beautiful. And you do get, I mean, I know not all fairies look like Lord of the Rings figures or look like Tinkerbells. I mean, I know Joe introduced this podcast by saying we're not talking winged Tinkerbells here, but sometimes you do get a description of something really beautiful.
And then I suppose at the same time, you think if you're this elemental spirit that can probably take whatever form you want, if you want to have a positive interaction with a human that you deem to be receptive to it, because I have no doubt that they probably wouldn't do that with someone who they thought was going to be like, ew, no. Would you not rate their kind of cultural consciousness for like how to choose the best form? So, because I think so many people react so positively to that kind of almost Victorian idea of like, you know, little and twee with the wings and everything. If they know that you're going to react positively to that, then it would stand to reason that if you could choose your form, that would be the one you would go for.
Yes. And I mean, it also sounds like a lot of angel encounters as well, like the golden light, and but also again UFO, not particularly like extraterrestrials, but interdimensional sort of beings. And there's always a lot of light involved. And that particularly golden light. And considering it was between 12 and 3, it's not that time of day where there's like golden light in the air. It's quite bright. I assume it was bright. It was either been cloudy, or it wouldn't have been that time of day where things glow, you know, that lovely time just before sunset.
Yeah, the light's really flat, even on like rubbish days. Like, I mean, obviously it's like 20 past 2 as we're recording and looking outside. I mean, it's totally overcast here. But yeah, the light is just really just kind of, I don't want to say monotone, but like, because obviously that's for sound, but you know what I mean? It's like, it just, yeah, there's absolutely no glow about it whatsoever. Whereas if it had been like the golden hour, like in photography out sort of sense, then you could go far enough. But yeah, if that's between 12 and 3, that's like the least supernatural time of day.
Exactly, yeah. It's normally twilight for these things, or as you say, the golden hour. And this is Rhondda in Wales, so we're talking about inner valley, so it could have been quite dark. There are some little bits of valleys where they don't get any sun all day. That's how dark it is. But I just thought it was really, I just, as you say, I love, especially after the first story I told you, I thought it was quite nice to say a different one. And I've totally forgot with the first story, he did describe the colours, red and green. So colours, I think it's the same everywhere. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in Wales, the colours of fairies are very, whenever there's an encounter, the person always describes them as being so vivid. And attention to detail is always kept. I mean, rather than, you know, like when someone describes a ghost story or a UFO story, they hazy on some things. When it's fairy, it seems to be such a detailed recollection, like down to the minutest details, sounds, smells, silky with,
I think the other thing I like about that particular sighting as well, or encounter, whatever you describe it as, is her feeling that like wanting to actually like collaborate with her house brownie. And this is one of the things that I can't remember who said it, but one of the people are following like the witchy community. It might have been Althea Sebastiani had been like, would people just stop doing this whole thing of, oh, I need to cleanse my house of all negative energy, I need to banish all spirits, because you're also going to be banishing the stuff that you actually want to keep. A little bit like, you know how like antibiotics just kill everything, good or bad. And
but it leaves you with sort of supernatural thrush.
That is the tagline for this episode, like.
Sorry.
But basically, yeah, and I think like, you know, there is a degree of, depending on which end you come at with this, if you believe that like some fairies are sort of like house spirits, or some fairies are land spirits or whatever, and they were basically beings who were here first. You know, the idea of actually living with them and whatnot, I think is such a nice way of looking at it. And you sort of think, so instead of you having to go around your house kind of spiritually cleansing it and what have you, you don't actually need to if you've got a good relationship with your house spirits, because they kind of do that for you. So I like the fact that she seems to be working with hers. As like just like housemates she doesn't see a lot of.
It's weird, isn't it? Because I think that with a lot of different like 40 and things, during lockdown there was an increase in sightings, especially with fairies. Now I was thinking about this because I'll tell you about it later, but I had an experience during lockdown, and I do wonder, you know, like how how busy life is now and how you're out of the house most of the day and then you're sleeping the rest of the time. The amount of time you're in your house, actually being in your house, you're still busy. You're cooking, you're trying to get kids ready to sleep, you're trying to do some work, you're trying to do a project, you're trying to keep on top of the housework. We very rarely have time just being. And lockdown, I think a lot of us decided, because we were staying in the house, we wanted to make it a home more. Like the amount of people, I mean, everybody did it. Everybody thought, how can I make this nicer? How can I make it more homely? And the amount of DIY projects that happened, the amount of gardening that happened. We seen house plants. Yeah. I mean, we made it, we engaged with the house more. I mean, one of the first like things I learned in witchcraft was talk to your house. It's an entity in itself. It's a place, it's a sanctuary. And I think we went back to making a sanctuary during that time. Unfortunately, I think it sort of fell off the radar a bit when everything went back to air quotes. Sorry, I always do this. It's a podcast. You can't see it. I'm doing air quotes, normal. Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of things sort of came out a bit more. We connected more with very basic vibes.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, I'd always been that kind of nutter who'd come home and be like, "Hi garden, hi house," even if I'm like the only one in, because yeah, you sort of think. I'm trying not to veer off into territory, because this is the kind of stuff I look at for my PhD on haunted houses. It's like that sense of, is the house sentient, or is it just like a collection of entities that you happen to cohabit with? And either way, I just like saying hello.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? But I suppose it is that thing of, you know, depending, as I say, which angle you come at, if you want to see these as being sort of land spirits, which appear in like literally every culture, or more specifically, fairies who've chosen to let you live with them, because I don't think it's the other way around.
No.
Then I sort of think, in a way, that's really cool. And those houses are probably much nicer to spend time in.
Yeah. You can tell when a house has got good vibes. When we were buying houses, you know, there was a house that we went to see and it was on paper lovely. It had everything we wanted, but no, couldn't tell you what it was. We could afford it and everything. It should have been an easy buy, but there was just something that didn't feel right.
That's why I'm kind of like, if I go in someone's house, like, to kind of like, do they have a cat? Is the cat happy? Then I'm happy.
That's a good one.
A good job, because I mean, I love cats anyway, and they tend to like me. So I'm kind of like, if the cat seems quite chilled out, then I've got nothing to worry about. And it's funny because I house sat for someone who at the time she only had 2 cats, but she's got 4 now, and they'd been experiencing some like weird stuff in their house. And there was like one day one of the cats was getting really quite uppity at a corner. And I just kind of like said out, like, I don't know who you are, but like, I'm not here normally. So if you're here for them, like, I can take a message, but you know, they'll be back whenever. And then they kind of all seem to like stop after that. So I don't know what that was all about. But yeah, definitely use the cats as a barometer.
I was going to say, you've got many jobs and one of them should be supernatural answer phone. Don't take a message.
Why not? Well, that's the thing. It's like mediums always make it like this really like, you know, ritualistic kind of thing, and I'm kind of like, well, imagine if you could just kind of use it like an ability. Like, I'm really good at admin, so you know what I mean. Like,
It take minutes.
that's just automatic writing, that though.
Yeah. Oh, do you have another one?
I do. It was quite interesting actually. This isn't the one I was going to do, but when you mentioned colour, this one is actually from Teesside, so it wasn't one that I originally had. And there's a place near the Tees called Tower Hill, and the fairies lived there, and they would go down to the Tees to bathe and wash their clothes. And there was this particular day, an old woman in the area must have been, I think she was coming home, and she'd found a fairy sitting on a small stone near a house. So the fairy was wearing green and had bright red eyes.
Oh.
And the old woman was absolutely so sort of taken with this sort of young fairy that she just took her home. And that's unusual, I think, among all the stories that I've read, at least from this area. Like, that's not traditionally something that you do. But she sat her by the fire, and she gave her, and it's really, really specific on this, that she actually fed her bread and butter with sugar. So the sugar, to me, kind of almost dates when this must have happened. And the fairy ate it, but then she started to cry. The old woman just couldn't console her. Nothing that she did would calm this fairy. So eventually she basically like took her back to where she'd found her. And once she was outside, the fairy stopped crying. So she wandered off, never to be seen again. But the old woman actually took the stone home, that she kind of kept almost like a what's the word? Like a sacred object. And it's a really short story. And obviously, again, there's no sort of names or dates or anything. But I like the fact you've got a material object involved. So whether that was a story somebody told to explain why there was a weird rock in someone's house. But it's just the description of the green outfit and the red eyes and
You know what it reminded me of?
What?
Green Children of Woolpit, where they couldn't eat. Well, one of them eventually got to eat human food, but the other one really didn't. Like the boy, he died, didn't he? But that's sort of like, was it coming into the house, or was it eating the food that made it cry?
It seems like it's the being brought inside is the bit that upsets her first. And I mean, like, I'm not being funny, but if I was just sitting minding my own business and someone somehow managed to pick me up, I mean, I'm assuming the fairy was a lot smaller, and then just took me home, I probably wouldn't burst into tears, but I wouldn't be very happy about it.
It is a little bit child snatchery.
Yeah, it's very, very wrong. The only decent thing that she does is at least she feeds her and then takes her back when obviously the fairies just having none of it. But because you sort of read a story like that and almost expect almost kind of like, you know, one of the fairy parents to turn up, because obviously we've got stories like that in Rothley, where you've got the story about the young lad who plays with a fairy who comes down his chimney. And there's one particular day they're sort of faffing about by the fire, and one of them ends up getting a cinder on, like the fairy gets a cinder on her foot, and when she starts kind of hollering, because that would obviously hurt, you know, like the fairy mother then comes in and starts kicking off, and it's only through verbal trickery that the young boy kind of gets out of it, because it's an accident anyway, but obviously I don't know how you'd explain that to an irate fairy mother. So you almost kind of expect the story to go in that sort of direction. And then it kind of veers off into, oh, well, I'll just put you back then.
I kind of really hope it was a fairy. Otherwise, she took a child, stuffed it full of sugar, and then just went, on, off you go.
Yeah, it is an odd one. And I think it's whether the fairy was near where the other ones used to go and bathe and wash their clothing, and she's just wandered off. I don't know if she lived, like, was local to the area where the old woman lived. Again, there's not enough details for us to be able to kind of pinpoint any of it, but I think there's enough in it that you kind of go, wow, that actually does stand apart from quite a lot of the other sort of fairy incidents that I've come across.
I think I saw something when I was having a look. There was another incident that happened in Durham. There was a place where people used to wash clothes. It seems like almost like household chores attract as well. Even if it's not in the house, it's still a chore. It's still something that needs to be done.
Yeah. There's something, I must admit, there's something about the whole getting fairies to do your chores for you thing that doesn't sit well with me. And I know you can't really pay them because they don't seem to like that. You've got to kind of sneakily leave stuff for them so that they don't realise that you're paying them. But there is a little bit of a kind of exploitation, if I dare say it, kind of. So as much as I'm kind of giggling, going, "Oh yeah, I would leave my house filthy for Silky or whatever," but at the same time, you do kind of think, like, to what extent is the tidying actually the fairy's choice?
Yeah, it does seem a little bit like almost like a punishment.
Mm. Unless you get one of the you know how you get people who just genuinely love cleaning.
Like Monica in Friends.
Yeah, and then if you've got the fairy equivalent of that, and it's actually like that's the funnest thing that they can do, then you kind of go, oh, well, fair enough. And you've also got some porridge or whatever out of it as well.
Have at it.
Mm.
When you could put like an advert somewhere, fairy brownie needed desperately. I think I've got one more, and then we could swap our tales.
Yes.
Okay. I picked this one because again, it straddles two different things. So it's from the census again. So this was in Wales, no location this time, so it could be anywhere. But it's from the 1990s. Again, it's a female who witnessed it. It says 11 to 20. Oh, that's their age. I wonder what that was. So that's quite a long period. That's quite general. So they're either 11 or 20, but it was inside a private house, and one other person shared the experience. So I do love a good multiple witness story. And this is between 6 and 9. And it happened in less than a minute. There was no fairy mood reported. They do have regular supernatural experiences. They were extremely happy. And just before the experience, they had a prickling and tingling. And they had a sense that the experience was put on especially for them. Unusually vivid memories of the experience and a sense that it marked a turning point in their life. And I know Joe asked that a lot when people come on the show and they tell, they're amazing stories. I love hearing people's stories. We all want a more magical world. And the amount of times it does seem that it marks a turning point in someone's life where there's going to be big change coming is quite a common thing. So I'm really glad they asked that question because it's interesting. So this is the story. A friend and I were home one evening relaxing, and my dog was out in the front garden. It was late autumn and we had candles lit, listening to music, discussing spirituality, religion. It was our passion at the time. I just like that scene. I want to go and sit there with them. We heard my dog, a spaniel, scratching at the front door to come in, and my friend went into the hall, leaving the lounge door open to the front and to open the front door for the dog. I was sitting in my chair and could clearly see 2 meters or so out into the hall. I heard a commotion, like an animal's feet running, and looked out into the hall expecting to see Ben, my spaniel, run past and up the stairs, and heard the heavy sound of it running up on all fours and shot up the stairs. It was, I'd say, if standing, 5 foot 5 inches, maybe more. It was sort of human crossed with an animal, and I could see brownish, leathery, tough skin with coarse black hair sporadically growing out of its body. Its head had a large flattened snout, crinkled and wrinkled like someone had forced its nose into its face, and upward protruding teeth. My friend heard it, but curiously didn't see it. The dog had not come in and was still out in the garden. And over a period of a few years, I and visitors to the house would see red lights, like eyes at night on the landing and stairs, and a few occasions hear the running up the stairs like a very large dog. I'm convinced it was a fairy, a puka, or something, or some other thing. The house got renovated in years later and all the occurrences stopped. A large black dog crossed with human characteristics or some other beast. Red eyes, upward big fangs from the bottom jaw. I've accidentally copy and pasted the same thing twice. I'll skip ahead. It was definitely connected to the old untouched energy before we modernised the house. We tried to use candles and hardly watched TV, preferring soft music at our groups of spiritual exploration there. There was lots of experiences by myself and others at the time, and then they put what they think they were. So fairies are other dimensional beings linked to our earth also and our psyches. They seem to reflect our hidden inner natures. I am very interested in the awakening of the UFO alien fairy connection worldwide and the connection to a multiverse and theories about other dimensions. Could it be the same thing? How is our human conscious connected? For we are connected, or we wouldn't have these experiences. Is it possible to actively seek a fairy encounter and therefore be privy to the mysteries? I like that one because black dogs connected to fairies aren't necessarily always a bad thing in Welsh folklore. I know we get a lot of, like, especially in Essex and East Anglia, you've got the shuck, and sometimes a death omen, sometimes causes deaths. But a lot of the time in Wales, I don't know if it's the same with you, but like big dogs or dog ghosts or black dogs, sometimes white, seem to be more protective. Like, they're there to protect people. They'll often follow someone home if they're on their own, even though they're scared at the time. It seems they were just accompanying them. And even though it ran into the house, it doesn't seem like it caused anything wrong. Almost like it was taking refuge, maybe because they were in that mindset. They were quite peaceful people. I don't know, it sounds almost like it ran in scared and found sanctuary.
Could be. I know we have that with the bar guest, which is obviously our black dog, which you kind of get sort of from Northumberland all the way down. I mean, you get it all the way down kind of like South Yorkshire and all the way across to the likes of Lancashire and whatnot. And yeah, the bar guest is a funny one, because in some stories it's like a death omen. Other stories, it's just mischievous and just kind of plays with people in the same sort of way Silky does. And then, yeah, there's also stories of people travelling at night, often women who are out, like, having to walk home at night or whatever, feeling accompanied by one. So that it's how the bar guest, again, seems to have that degree of consciousness of, like, it chooses what it wants to do.
Yeah.
Which feels more like a cat than a dog to me. And that feels very feline of, yeah, I can't be bothered today. But I think, yeah, the idea of it running into the house is an interesting one, because you don't, I mean, at least in the stories of the bar guest anyway, you don't really hear stories of it inside. It's nearly always outside.
Yeah. Or, like, I think there's been times where it's got to be almost like a vampire invited in, whereas on this occasion, and the fact the dog didn't seem to react either, or it did and didn't sense a threat, and the person they were with heard it, I liked. And the red eyes, I mean, red eyes have been given a bad rap. You know, it's a very easy thing to give something red eyes in Hollywood, and it's like, oh, it's evil. Whereas fairies, I mean, the story you just told, the fairy child had red eyes. It doesn't always play out the same in folklore, does it?
Yeah, and I think when you think about it as well, you sort of think, when you think in terms of, say, animals that have red eyes, you know, it's like, is that a useful function? You know, in terms of what it does, is it just a particular color that? Because when you think about it, like, if you think about, say, blue eyes, that doesn't actually make any sense why there would be that color. Like, I know obviously they're supposed to be paler for an evolutionary reason, but why blue? Why not pale lavender? You know what I mean? So it's kind of, I sort of feel like there's so much kind of almost this random about humans that you sort of think, why wouldn't that also be the case for fairies as well?
Yeah, there must be a reason or a rhyme. I like the little thing they said. I mean, because I've touched on it a couple of times, but the link between UFO and alien needs something running and taking sanctuary. I mean, it could, you know, fairy. I mean, it does also, I mean, it sounds very similar to a skinwalker. And, you know, that's sort of like half, like somewhere between a human and an animal, especially a dog. It's almost like they're halfway between a transformation. You know, it's not quite there and like squished, you know, it's almost like it was in trouble.
Yeah, I know with the bar guest, there's also an idea that they can take on different forms as well. So, like, there's somewhere, you know, people are like, oh, it could take the form of a black dog, a white horse, or a headless man on fire. And you're like, how did you know that was all the same spirit?
Yeah.
But it is again, it's that sense of, is the creature choosing to present itself in that fashion? Which is, it's a slight tangent, but this is one of my favourite things I remember someone ever said about The Little Mermaid, and it was about Ursula, the fact that she could take the form of, like, the woman who fits Western beauty standards, but she chooses to be the octopus lady instead, and I love her all the more for that.
I love the octopus lady look.
But she's quite clearly, obviously, a supernatural creature of some description. So you sort of think, so there's a level of choice on display there,
Mm.
You know, and obviously I know that comes from a fairy tale rather than actual folklore, but you do think, you know, there is enough folklore where animals or fairies rather take the form of animals, that you think, well, do they get to decide what they look like? Is it a little bit like when you're playing a video game and it's like, right, what race am I going to be in Warcraft? Am I going to be a druid? Am I going to be a night elf? Am I going to be a tauren or whatever? Do they have like a character selection screen as well, and they get to choose what they look like?
Oh, I hope they do. That'd be brilliant. Oh, I like the fact they completely jumped to fairy too. There was no like, oh, it could be a cryptid, you know, like a werewolf even. It was a fairy. They obviously got that sense straight away, straight out the gate.
Yeah,
It's not your typical fairy sighting, is it?
no, that's the thing, but I also wonder if they, because they're already interested in this kind of stuff, obviously therefore are open-minded enough that their brain would sort of make those connections, because they've obviously come across enough stuff that would be where their brain would go. I don't know.
Don't know. But an interesting one.
Very much so.
I want to hear about your encounter.
Well, I was going to say, actually, I've got one very, very, very short.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Sightings. And the reason I want to include these ones is because of the fact that we've just been talking about fairies choosing their form.
Okay.
And I was like, oh yeah, that feels more like a cat. Well, we've got two incidents. And one of them actually includes like the exact farm and the farmer's name, which is quite unusual. And this is about fairies taking the form of cats and then living with farmers.
That totally makes sense.
So in one of them, it was at Beggarbush Farm near Easington in County Durham, and the farmer was called John Bonner, and he was heading home one night with his cart when something leapt out of the hedge, and it cried, "Johnny Bonner, Johnny, when thou gets home, tell your cat Catherine Curley's deed," which is basically saying like, "Get home, tell your cat Catherine Curley's died." And then John turned round and just found like this massive cat sitting in the back of the cart. It then left back out again into the hedge. He obviously continued going home, somewhat discombobulated by what's just happened. And then his wife sort of says, that, "What's the matter with you?" when he gets home. So he repeats what's happened, at which point the pet cat then jumps up and goes, "Oh, Monawa," and then just runs out the door and then never saw the cat again. And then there's a similar one in Staindrop, and that was where people generally assumed that cats were fairies in feline form anyway. And essentially the cats kind of rushed to leave so that they could attend a family funeral. And the stories here don't explain why the fairies were in feline form and why they were living with farmers. But it does also show that, like, would they have just stayed with the family forever had there not been the death announcement? And I think I like the County Durham one because of the fact that we've got the guy's name. And the idea that kind of somebody, like another fairy's coming, and rather than going to the cat, he's like, "Oh, the farmer's there, he'll do," and I'll just tell him. And I just kind of, I quite like that one because again, it's like fairies are getting to choose what form they take. So are they cats around each other, or are they cats just while they're around people?
Oh, that is interesting. Almost like Toy Story. Perhaps when, you know, we see them, they're cats, but as soon as you go out the room. And also, it reminds me of a little bit as well, Jeff the Talking Mongoose. I mean, at the time, I mean, if you do, I mean, it's, you know, it's supposed to have been debunked, but, you know, the little girl was supposed to be, I'm not so sure about that one, but I do like it because I like that story. But they had released loads of mongoose onto the island to deal with a rabbit problem. And if maybe you were an entity that thought, oh, what shall I disguise myself as so I fit in? Mongoose. There's lots of them around. And cats, you always seem to, you know, you get cats in farms. They're good rat catchers. If you wanted to hang out in a particular life.
I feel like as well that because cats are already notorious for coming and going as they please, then like if you're going to choose any animal, then I think a cat is a pretty good one.
Yeah, they're pretty autonomous.
Yeah, and also like when you consider they're crepuscular as well, like people expect them to be out and about sort of at dawn and dusk, and they're often out a bit more at night and so on. So you kind of think like it would fit in. Like if you decided you were going to be like a chicken, that would be a really terrible choice of animal. Whereas because the cat's got a fair degree of autonomy on a farm, they're practically feral anyway, and you think they can come and go, and nobody's going to wonder, oh, where's the cat gone? Because you're like the cat will have gone wherever it needed to go.
Hmm.
And then it makes you think, are all cats fairies? Is that why some of them are really, really cuddly and some of them just like pushing things off any flat surface?
Well, the ancient Egyptians did like their cats. I mean, the amount of there was something weird. It was at the Uncanny conference in Cardiff for the witch farm, and there was an Egyptologist there that said that the amount of cats buried with like in like sarcophagus and everything at the full works, they ended up selling them by the ton to English farmers and British farmers to use as fertilizer, and that's why we find a lot of Egyptian jewelry and Egyptian like finds in Britain, is because Egyptian cats were used as fertilizer in Britain. So there's a lot. That's a lot of spirit energy going into our crops.
I think as well, there's a really good documentary on Netflix, and it's about some excavations at Saqqara, and they actually find like an entire cat graveyard.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting sort of seeing like, and to the extent that they've even got like lions among them. The extent that obviously, cats had that sort of signification, and obviously, partly for practical reasons. Same reason why there was so much sort of fascination and respect for snakes, because again, you want things that aren't gonna, they're gonna kill the things that are gonna eat your stuff. But then I think in this country, again, you sort of think like, is that part of like the collective unconscious that we've picked up that idea of cats? Or do they just know something we don't?
Well, they do have that knowing look, don't they?
Like they know, but they'll never tell you because they can't be bothered.
Whereas dogs know and they want to tell you, but they can't.
Whether you're interested or not.
Oh, I think we covered some good stories there. I think it's time to share our own.
Yeah, do you want to go first, Ursula?
I don't mind. I don't mind going first with mine.
You go first then.
Mine happened. Was it during Yeah, it was during lockdown. And my kitchen, the cooker is right next to the back door, so I often open the back door to let some cool air in. And it looks out. It's a really lovely view. It's right over the sunset and the garden. And just outside the garden, I've got all my herbs. So if I'm cooking, I can literally put my hand out and get some rosemary, stick it straight in the pan. And during lockdowns, like to keep my kids entertained, we started doing some rewilding. So we got loads of like wildflower seeds, and partly laziness and partly rewilding. We didn't mow, lots of the lawn, and it did actually go really pretty. We had poppies, we had loads of things growing, and it was really lovely. And the garden really felt like it was coming alive a bit. It wasn't quite so prescriptive borders and things. And my son was really interested in fairies. I've always been, but he really got the bug for it, and he wanted to build a little fairy home and things. And so we tried our best. And then this night, as I said, when I was cooking, I heard some scuffling outside the back door. And I thought, oh, the hedgehogs are back, because we have hedgehogs every year. And I stuck my head out the door, and it was twilight. So it was sort of like, the sun had gone, but hadn't quite set. So it was like that grey, silvery time. And there was this little thing about a foot high that looked like a potato with a hat, little legs and arms, stood upright, and it was rummaging around in my herbs. It was like mumbling to itself. And then it looked up, and there was a split second where we looked at each other. And I was like, my heart had fallen out my arse by this point, because it was like, what the hell is that? And it was looking at me like, you can see like, it was so fleeting, but you get enough information. I could see its face. It was like, you shouldn't be able to see me. And it ran off down the garden swearing, like proper like proper effing and jeffing, like under its breath. And yeah, ever since then, I mean, it's not so much now, but I've had things going missing in the house more than normal. I mean, I do put a lot down to me having brain fog, and it's not exactly like a Country Life magazine. Our house is messy because we've got kids. Yeah, that's the excuse. But it was odd. Like I put something down, look away for 2 seconds, come back, and it would be gone, or in an odd place. My herbs keep going missing. I went to make a chili the other day and found half of it, like all the jars that I knew were half full were empty. And I would be sitting on the sofa and stones would be thrown at my head inside. I'd be sat, it would just be me and my son. He'd be on the opposite sofa reading a book or playing on his, Nintendo Switch. And then sweets that I know he had next to him, it was almost like they were reporting and like dropping on my head. And I couldn't hear it, but I could sense that this thing was having a real good time, like winding me up. And then I'd be out and about, I'd have stones thrown at my head, walking to work. I'd be walking down the village and a stone would hit my head. Only about that big, nothing to actually do any damage. And then it followed me to work, and it all happened. All this started happening since we had a hawthorn bush in our front garden. And I remember asking you, do you remember? I was like, we need to move it because it's literally on the path. And at the time, I wasn't sure if I was going to be in a wheelchair, and I had my son in his buggy, and I needed to get past. So I needed to cut it down. And I was like, okay, if it's already annoyed that I saw it, how's it going to be if I pull up a hawthorn? And it was answered for me because while I was out one day, someone who we paid to come and clear the garden pulled it up. So I don't know if he's had anything since. But it followed me to work as well. I mean, I was in work one day and it was almost like it had like a little personality, and I could sense when it was about to do something, or I could sense when something had happened if it had been the thing. Because yeah, I could tell it was near. And I was in work, and I used to sit next to this guy who was so skeptical, like proper, like no nonsense, like, doesn't believe in any of it. And I was trying to say, my coffee mug started moving across the table, like proper, not like a little bit, like from me, and went all the way across at a steady pace to him. And we were both watching it, and I was like, "You seeing this?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah." Someone must be drilling nearby, and the vibrations. I was like, "Oh, leave it alone." He was like scrambling for these like things. And then a bunch, because like my job, we keep all the keys to the university, and we've got them in a big cupboard. And there's a bunch of keys that just appeared in the middle of the room and fell on the floor. And I went to pick them up, and it wasn't one of our keys. And then someone came running in and said, "I just had keys on my table 2 minutes ago. I can't find them. They're master keys." And it was those keys. They had like just appeared in the middle of our room. And then I went to put away some keys later in the day, put them in the cupboard. Now the cupboard is a wooden cupboard with hooks, like blunt hooks. And I put my hand in, and I felt this stabbing. I felt this weird pain in my finger, brought it out, and there was a shard of metal, like it looked like a little tiny dagger in my finger. And I had blood pouring down my hand, and I was just like, this is unreal. And then I had to go to security where they couldn't get it out. I had to, luckily my friend was staying with me, and he's in the St. John's ambulance, and for some reason he had his kit with him, and he managed to get it out. But it was about, again, this is a podcast. Oh no, you can see this is Joe, so it's a video. It was about that big, and it was in my finger. It's healed completely. That's the weird thing. There's no scar. That's it.
You just talk all about like it's just completely normal now, and it's just like, yeah, this and I'm sort of sitting there going,
I know it became so normal.
Does it still happen now?
I had something. Well, the herbs are still going missing. I've tried to talk to it because I asked Jo as well what to do, and she's very confident. If you like talk, if it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel right. But sometimes if you like sort of try and connect, and I tried to, and I sort of like have started talking to it in the garden, but being quite bantery, like, "I can see you there, you little git." And then it's almost like we've got like a little I couldn't tell this to anybody else, could I? This is the right podcast to talk about it on. But we've sort of like got an understanding now. I hope.
Bit of an armistice then.
Yeah, we like sort of like, yeah, and I'm if it is a boggart, I'm hoping it turns into a brownie. Maybe if I leave some washing out or something, maybe that's what it wants. It's craving housework.
Yeah. I mean, there is also the other thing. Try leaving out an offering of clothing for it.
I don't want it to go though. I know it's throwing stones at me, but I think it's so fascinating. I've left it honey, I've left it mead, I've left it bread. Actually, since I've done that, it stopped throwing things at me.
Oh,
it's just pinching my herbs, which, oh, all right.
I suppose you can just go more.
So yeah, as long as it doesn't take long, just leave some for me.
Very interesting that though. Like, I mean, I would be freaking out if any of that was me.
I quite like. I think it makes me laugh.
And
you should have seen it though. It was livid. This little tiny, you know, when like a child swears, you can't help but laugh. I was this little. He looked like a potato. It was like, you know, Alistair Beckett King's video, "The Man Who Lives in the Crisps." That. Imagine that running down the garden swearing at you.
It's funny though how much, like, so much of it kind of sounds like, again, poltergeist activity. And this isn't my encounter, but I'm going to tell the story anyway, just because it's quite funny. An ex of mine was a massive fan of Final Fantasy, and I bought a figure on eBay, which was my first mistake, and it was of Squall, and it was one of the ones where they're about year big. They're like the collector ones.
Yeah.
And gave him his Squall figure and displayed it in his room, and then it started moving around the flat of its own accord. And the weirdest one was you had to go from like his room through the living room, the little hallway into the bathroom, and he was out in the garden and like out the back, and I was in the flat by myself, or so I thought. And I went from the bedroom where it was sitting on the bedside table, and then I walked into the bathroom and it was sitting on the side of the bath. And I thought, I haven't carried it because why would I take it to the bathroom?
Yeah.
Like, you know, my hands were empty. And I walked into the bathroom and I'm like, why? And then I was like, whatever you want, you might want to leave the room because, like, I don't want an audience, you know, when I'm using the loo. And, but yeah, it was just, it would appear, and like one day it appeared inside the shed, which was padlocked shut. I wasn't there for that one. You just told us about it later. But yeah, so the idea of stuff going from one space to another, that's always fascinated me.
Or apportation,
physically, how does it work?
I'd love to witness it, not like see the end result, but actually see it. Because with like fairy encounters, you often hear that they heard a pop. Almost like something appeared, like, you know, if they are interdimensional beings, like that's them entering our. Maybe that's how they do objects too. Little arm comes in and grabs it, takes it out. Yeah.
That makes it feel very Tom and Jerry.
It does a bit, doesn't it?
Oh, we'd have to have some kind of like kapow on the screen or something.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I think as well it also completely contradicts the idea of like fairies as being like the Cottingley fairy type design.
Yeah. Well, mine definitely isn't.
Like a scary Mr. Potato Head in the garden kind of seems a little bit comical.
It does, doesn't it? That's it. I mean, if it was a giant thing throwing rocks at me, but it's tiny and throwing pebbles, and it's almost like, is it want attention? I don't know. It's like a child wanting attention. Or like, you come out going, nah, 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 nah. Yeah, I want to hear yours.
Mine's a weird one, because again, it straddles that, is it a fairy, is it a ghost, territory. And mine's not any, and this is the thing, like I hear all these different encounters and I'm like, oh man, I wish something like that would happen to me. And then I'm like, do I really? Because I mean, I remember when I went to Edinburgh and I did one of the tours for the Mackenzie Poltergeist, and there was only like 8 of us on the tour, and I was like, oh man, I really hope something happens to someone else. Nothing happened. But mine though, where I live, it's like typical late 70s suburb outside Newcastle. And when where my house is, like, because all the houses are arranged in like courts, so it's like really like, I don't want to say like traffic free. It's just there's no like through traffic a lot of the time. Like you only drive into the courts because you live there or you're visiting, sort of thing. So it's quite safe for kids playing out and whatnot. Like, there was a kid out the front the other day. She's learning to roller skate. So of course, there's a nice big expanse of like where people park for it to sort of practice on.
Yeah.
And the path in front of my house, because like we're at the end of the block, but then there's like a wall at the end, so you can't get through to like the other part of the estate. And there's the path along the front of my house, and the only reason you'd be coming along there is because you come into my house or next door, or you've decided to just randomly wander around a housing estate and come halfway along and then go, oh, I can't get through at the end, which happens a freakish amount. But anyway. And you would think the fact that there's a massive firethorn bush and a whole load of ivy and everything at the end of the path, you would think would tell people you can't come through this way. But, you know, there's no account for people's lack of navigational abilities. And ever since I was little, and obviously the stuff out the front, obviously I think my parents put a lot of what's in the front garden sort of back in the late 70s. And it used to be a lot easier to kind of see out the front because everything just hadn't grown as much yet. But you used to be aware of movement past the front window, and you would kind of go to look, but you never saw anything directly. It was literally only ever peripheral vision. And sometimes, because we've got like a frosted panel sort of next to the front door, kind of, but like in the living room, sort of above where the telephone is, you would see a shadow of someone coming towards the door. But then if you went to the door, there was literally no one there. There was no one on the path. There was no one going back the other way. It was just very, very odd. And I used to notice them when I was little. It never scared me. It was just, oh, the random figures are coming past again. And I'd mentioned it to my mother one day, and she's like, oh, thank God you're seeing them as well. Because she'd been seeing them but didn't want to mention them in case it put ideas in my head. But because I was then like, no, I've seen them too. And then it turned out I think my brother had seen them as well. My dad's never noticed them, but like I described him to you earlier, saying he's psychic as a house brick. So, you know, he's just, and the thing is as well, when my dad sits in the living room, he usually has his back to the front window anyway, so he's like the least likely to, I like, that's his chair, he's least likely to say anything anyway. So there seemed to be a lull for a while where we didn't really see them, and then I think it was shortly after I moved back up from London, and in case anyone's like, oh my God, can't believe a person her age is still living with her parents, like PhDs are expensive. You know what I mean? And like I get on really well with my parents, so you know I'm quite fortunate in that regard. But anyway,
Yeah.
So, and I happen to be like, oh, the people are back out the front, and my mum was like, what? Like, we haven't seen them in ages. And obviously, like this time of year, it's a bit more difficult because of the fact we've got like this whopping great fuchsia bush, and there's a huge spirea, so you can't really see the path as easily. But periodically, and even if I've been upstairs and you get a better view down on the path, I've been aware of movement and obviously looked out when there's no one there. And the thing that always struck me is they're dressed in brown, which isn't a colour that I would associate with ghosts.
No.
In terms of fairies, the only one I can think of is the brown men of the moors, which you have up on Simon's side. Who are like little gentlemen dressed in brown, who you wouldn't want to have wandering around outside your house. So it's a bit of an odd one, but it's just the fact that because they kind of just sort of disappear, as it were. It did make me wonder, obviously, if they were actually ghosts, when I discovered that this area had quite a lot of Bronze Age and Iron Age settlements at one stage, because when the house was built, it was essentially on farmland, so it's not like there's been like a lot of heavy industry or habitation here. I mean, you see people on Time Team like digging up Roman villas and stuff, and I think my dad once managed to find a camshaft from a tractor engine in the garden. Like that's that's our sort of prehistoric find. And but ultimately though, like it's kind of almost got that like prehistoric sort of, like, not prehistoric, that's the wrong word, like pre-Roman sort of like settlements in the area. So I was like, oh, is it actually spirits associated with those, in the same way that people see Roman armies just kind of mooching about, not interacting with the world now. They're kind of almost like echoes. Are they actually like the good neighbours, and that's just a through way for them to get somewhere? Or are they actually land spirits of some description? I don't know. But the fact that I never feel worried by them. And this is the funny thing, actually, like where we are, and I don't know if it's because I've accidentally, and actually my parents as well have sort of forged like a positive relationship with any land spirits, because like obviously we take care of the garden. We have stuff grown in our garden which shouldn't grow in that soil, but for some reason those plants will grow. We have, obviously we feed the birds. I went out to feed them this morning. And the sparrows aren't very good at waiting for you to finish. So you'll be halfway through hanging one set of things up, and then they'll come down, and then they're like, "Oh God, you're still here!" And then they kind of try and fly into you. Obviously, I've started feeding our little hedgehog, who turned up a couple of months ago, and now comes every night for his tea. Oh, he's so cute. I nicknamed him Sonic because obviously I did.
Oh, obviously.
But so obviously we'll feed the birds, we'll look after the plants and everything. We don't have to use pesticides now because the birds do that for us. They eat all the aphids and everything like that. So we've got like, obviously we did like no more May and everything, and I grow wildflowers at the back. So, we've got like, and like, we sort of, we care for the little pocket of nature that we've got. My mum actually rescued a tree out the front because we've got these 4 like maple trees opposite. And one of them, when the council were mowing the grass out the front, the cutler thing, the ones that they ride round, like took an absolute chunk out the side of this tree. And
God.
Nobody knows what possessed me mum to do this, but she went straight to the local garden centre and bought some stuff that you could then paint over like the wound. And the tree's slightly smaller than the other 3, but it's quite healthy. It's sort of like, it does all the things it's supposed to do, basically. So obviously she's essentially like saved this tree. And so we do kind of wonder if, it feels quite welcoming. I mean, I've had people sort of come to see me before who are like really awkward and like stiff and like just socially awkward people in other people's houses. And then they come in here and then they're like, oh, sort of thing.
Oh, that's lovely.
I don't know if we've accidentally formed quite a positive relationship with any good neighbours or lands. I tend towards the land spirits, I must admit.
Yeah.
But it does make me wonder if that's who those figures actually are. And that's why we sort of have like that slightly more welcoming vibe. So my encounter is like a weird lifelong one. But it is that, are they ghosts? Are they fairies? Are they something else? Who knows?
You want any ley lines there?
I've no idea.
I've only just started getting interested in ley lines. But yeah, you don't seem to be able to get any like good maps, especially of this area, because I'm interested to see because this house seems to be on like a little flight path for UFOs, and we've also got plants growing that shouldn't be growing. I think that's something I never even thought of before. Do you ever get butterflies trying to like come in your house, like at the windows, like really trying to come in?
No, the garden's an absolute haven for bees. Moths will, but that's because moths are just, oh my God, light. Spiders love coming in the house. I'm forever ejecting them back outside again. Particularly the size of some of them, because you're like, you are not staying in here, pal. I'll have to charge you rent. And we did have a sparrow flew into the kitchen once. It was last year, actually, because there was a crow or a jackdaw or something, or it might be a magpie, chasing this baby sparrow, and it flew into the kitchen. And my dad thought it had flown back out again, and we thought nothing more of it. And then the following morning, like, because we didn't hear a peep out of anything in the kitchen, I opened the kitchen doors, like literally there, to go in the kitchen to make me coffee, and this like sparrow just flew at us. And it sort of flew to the dining room, then to the living room, and it got like stuck behind the blinds. So of course, we ended up like just opening the side window and then kind of, encouraging it along behind the blind. So eventually it flew off. But because every time you try to like grab it with a towel, it just cheeped at you, and I was like, oh no, I'm going to hurt it. I'll just open the window instead. But yeah, so apparently, birds see us as a safe haven as well, which is
Supposed to
nice.
be bad omen, aren't they? We had I didn't realise a robin had flown into the house until it was night. I put my son to bed. He was asleep. It was really dark, his room. And I heard this fluttering around the room. And I first thought bats. I was like, oh my God, because it sounds quite loud when it's in an enclosed space. There was a baby robin. It still had a little bit of yellow on its beak. And it let me pick it up. So, and then I could feel this little heartbeat in oh, that's so sweet. I feel this little heartbeat. And I took it outside and it went on its merry way. But then, the folklorist in me was like, a robin in the house, a robin in the house. Oh my God. But I saved it. So I think the balance was addressed.
Yeah, people said that to me when I said that I just managed to eject a baby sparrow from that. Oh, that's a bad omen. I'm like, not really. I personally, I don't ascribe anything negative to that because I'm like, it got away from the thing that was chasing it. It came into the house for a reason. And my dad checked and it didn't poo on any of the cabinets or anything because obviously that's what we're obviously worried about. But, whatever it was doing up there, it was obviously having a whale of a time. So we were, I thought it saw our house as somewhere safe.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take that as a win. But I do think that, when I think back to flats I had when I was in London, they've all had like a similar kind of vibe to them. So it does make you sort of think, like, are people drawn to particular spirits that already inhabit them? And you just kind of find like who you're compatible with. I mean, obviously I didn't have any choice in this house because obviously I've lived here all my life, but I do think that the more you become kind of rooted in your, like you were saying before, in your home and in your landscape. And I mean, I sometimes go around picking up rubbish and stuff along, and there's like a little burn near me, and people will insist on throwing disposable vapes into it because they're known to be biodegradable.
Yeah, of course.
And so obviously I'll try and tidy up a little bit and whatnot. So you do then start to wonder, like, if you are kind of like positively rooted in the space a little bit better, are you then kind of a better ambassador for humans?
I think so. I think it does get noticed. I noticed since we started doing more than it seems to open you up a bit more. Things like that. And the more open you are with yourself, like since starting the podcast, Eerie Essex, and like just being open to talk to people and people going, yes, I got someone to talk to about it, sort of has the same effect. I don't know if you get the same with fabulous folklore. You sort of like exercise that part of your brain, maybe.
Yeah, I must admit, I seem to attract mostly people asking how they can like break curses on them, and I'm fascinated why people associate me with that when that's not something that I really talk about. And it's like, I wasn't becoming Giles from Buffy wasn't on my bingo card.
What an amazing life goal, though.
I met him; he's lovely. Yes,
I always had a crush on him. Everyone liked Spike and Angel, not Giles.
But
I forget this is a video. Just seeing us going, oh, Anthony head.
Lisa says he's lovely. But yeah, I don't know. I think it is one of those things as well where the more, when you're saying about like wanting there to be more magic in the world, I think the more that you talk about these things and yeah, I mean, like my dad's like one of the biggest skeptics going, but then I think there's still part of him that would quite like to have the sort of experiences that like me and my mum have had. Because ours have always felt like they were more at the ghost end of the spectrum. Like nothing like substantial enough to be like, I should be on uncanny. It's like everything's just been like quite like almost just mundane and like, nah, it just happened. And so I kind of, when I then hear sort of people having fairy sightings, I'm kind of like, oh wow, that's so cool.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of podcasters. I think Aaron from the Appalachian or Appalachian, as he says. I'm so used to saying Appalachia, is desperate to have an encounter, which is a really good podcast, by the way.
Well, I know well, just quickly on that one, I interviewed Ed. He explained that the way you remember how to say it is it's as if someone threw an Appalachia.
Appalachia. Yeah. Love it.
That's how I remember it as well, because otherwise I'm like, what?
Should we let Joe's listeners go?
Probably, yeah, because otherwise we'll just be like talking about all things folklore, and that's not the point.
No. And we hope you've enjoyed. It's not the usual Modern Fairy Sightings, but Joe will be back next episode, I think. Yeah. So Joe will be back. Business will resume as usual. I hope we've done a good job.
I'd also like to hear if anyone's had experiences similar to ours, like
Yes.
me seeing random figures, because they are modern sightings, and you having, swearing potato head. If anyone's had them, then I think it'd be fabulous to hear about that, because then it would just be really cool. Is that actually quite a common thing that people have been like, oh, I can't talk about that, people think I'm weird, and we're both like, no, it's fine.
Absolutely, yeah. We're here. I'd love to know if someone else has got a swearing potato man.
And I'd love to know if people just see like random figures walking past the house that nobody else seems to see.
I see. I want to come to your house anyway, but now I really want to come to your house.
I can't predict when they'll turn up. That's the thing. But
I'll just stay.
Yeah, and like
until they do.
This morning there was like a white. I swear to God, I saw a white cat in my front garden, but like there wasn't actually anything there, and I was just like, "What?"
We've just said our cat's fairies.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and cats love me as well, so I'm fine.
Or maybe it knew you were going to do this podcast, and it was like an omen.
I want to be famous.
Good or bad, depending on what people made of this episode. Okay, thank you for listening to us ramble.
Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it.
Okay, bye.
Cheerio.